and I'm so grateful today to have this esteemed panel with us for today's webinar, which will focus specifically on the xenophobia being spawned by the coronavirus and the danger it poses to minority groups. So we, as Sasha said, have a slight change in the schedule as we initially anticipated it because of the change in the call of the Democratic Caucus. But I do want to thank the members who've joined us today and just tell everyone on the line that I'm grateful that in these times that you're choosing to spend a few minutes with us here at ADL. I want to encourage everyone to make sure you and your families are healthy and safe and that you're holding up well, you know, under the circumstances of this sort of unprecedented challenge caused by COVID-19. So we're privileged to be joined this afternoon by three of the most distinguished members of the U.S. House of Representatives. First, the Honorable Judy Chu, chairwoman of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, who represents California's 27th Congressional District and the city of Los Angeles. She long has been a leader in the Asian Pacific American community struggle to head off xenophobia and violence that can have dangerous real-world repercussions. I also want to acknowledge and welcome the Honorable Sylvia Garcia, a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, whose Houston community has large Asian and Hispanic populations. Congresswoman Garcia has been a national leader in pushing back against unfounded accusations that migrants are to blame for bringing the coronavirus into the United States. And lastly, my friend, the Honorable Debbie Wasserman Schultz, co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Black-Jewish Relations and former head of the Democratic National Committee. Her South Florida district is a cosmopolitan one with large representations of Hispanics, Jewish, international, and other constituencies, and Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz has been a national leader in confronting anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of hate from domestic extremists. Again, I'd like to welcome all three of the Congresswomen, and thank you again for joining us today. I'd like to start the questions by going first to Congresswoman Chu. The repeated reference by elected officials at the highest of levels of the coronavirus as the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus seems designed to spark racism and spawn division. I personally have heard concerns from the Asian American and Pacific Islander community about xenophobia directed against them and people who are perceived of being of Chinese ethnicity. In fact, I wrote an op-ed last week in the USA Today with my friend Andrew Yang about this issue. Can you tell us a little bit about the xenophobia and scapegoating that you are seeing in your congressional district and how the Asian American community is grappling with the challenge of COVID-19?
Well, to say that there is an alarming rise of anti-Asian coronavirus xenophobia is an understatement. It started in January with dirty looks, insults, and misinformation that Asian businesses should be avoided because they would contaminate people with the disease. But in the last month, it's escalated to spitting, yelling, and physical attacks against Asian Americans. And it's happening all around the country. In New York, there was a physical assault on a subway against a woman for wearing a face mask. In Philadelphia, an Asian man and woman were kicked and punched by a group of young people on a subway platform. In Texas, a man stabbed 3 Asian Americans, 2 of them children, at a Sam's Club, saying that he wanted to kill Asian Americans. In the Bay Area, a man had to be stopped from beating up an Asian American man because he coughed at a Daly City Target store. And in Los Angeles, a 16-year-old boy was sent to the hospital when he was attacked by bullies who accused him of having coronavirus. In fact, according to the 3 API hate crime reporting sites, there have been over 1,000 hate crime incidents reported in the last 5 weeks. But what is Donald Trump doing? He's just fanning the flames of xenophobia by insisting on calling it the China virus. And that is despite the fact that responsible health leaders have warned against that term because it causes stigma. And that includes Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the CDC, Robert Redfield, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, and the World Health Organization. So this is very dangerous. We have called out the president and other Republican leaders who are following this terminology every single time that they do it, because we want people to know that this is a global pandemic. And now is the time for us to unite and help one another so we can get through this crisis.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. And let's talk a little bit in a few minutes about what we can do in response to that. Now, I'd like to go to Congresswoman Garcia. Congresswoman Garcia, you are from arguably the most diverse city in the country. And we know that immigrants are one of the most vulnerable communities to the threat of COVID-19. And I think that Latino immigrants in particular find themselves in the crosshairs in this moment in many ways. And they already have experienced a great deal of hate since the 2016 election, as reports of harassment, vandalism, and violence directed against people who are perceived to be Mexican or Hispanic. Those numbers are way up, even though we know these incidents are vastly underreported. Moreover, Latinos disproportionately are represented in detention centers, and immigration and customs enforcement officials just the other day announced the first immigrant being held in an ICE detention center who had tested positive for the coronavirus, albeit there may be many more. With more than 37,000 immigrants in these detention centers, as well as private and local jails, often under conditions of overcrowdedness and lacking adequate health care and sanitation, what are your concerns about the ways that immigration policies could exacerbate the spread of the coronavirus, both inside these centers, I guess also beyond?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for putting this panel together of some of our best and brightest from Washington, and it's great to be on this program with them. Let me just say that once again, in this area, it comes straight from the White House. I think when you've got a president who reportedly, said to a few people at the White House that the upside to the coronavirus was that now he really had an even better excuse to keep the Mexicans and built his wall. When you hear that kind of comment, whether you were there or whether it was just reported, it just again makes it more frightening that we still have that kind of mentality leading our policy and leading this fight against the coronavirus. This is a time we should all be together fighting this virus and its spread, not fighting each other with hateful words of discrimination and hate. And it's got to stop, and it begins at the White House. Having said that, I think you're absolutely right. There's been a lot of concern about the sanitary conditions of the detention centers and the baby jails around the country. We had those concerns before the virus, and now all it means is not even more alarming rate. Same is true for prisons. I got a call early after the outbreak that even some of the immigration courts were not providing sanitizers or wipes or anything. So I think there's just a level of lack of concern, which was there before, but has been heightened by this virus. So we need to continue fighting it, making demands of ICE. I know many of us have written letters to the appropriate officials, and we'll continue to fight. And I joined Representative Chu in just how unconscionable it is that we're really not going to be able to take care of everyone with a cash payment assistance. And again, when you hear the reports from Speaker Pelosi, that it was the Republicans who would just not move on making sure that unauthorized immigrants could also receive that benefit. I mean, they consciously made that decision. That's what we're dealing with. But it's not just our community, it's any people of color. I know for us here in Houston, we have a growing Asian population. and one of our most trusted news reporters on camera when she was trying to cover the shoppers. One person just approached her and started belittling her and made some discriminatory remarks, and it was all caught on camera. And again, it's the sentiment that it comes from someone in the White House who's calling this a Chinese virus and Asian virus and all the other ugly words that he's using. We've all got to work together, especially during this time, to make sure that we can fight back and stay focused on fighting the virus, not each other.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly. I'd like to turn to Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz. After news broke that the George Washington University had quarantined Jewish students who attended this year's APAC conference, some of those students reported that they were then being harassed on Twitter and even in person with anti-Semitic messages. And we've seen very hateful messages directed at Jewish communities here in New York, in the community of New Rochelle, and in Brooklyn, where a COVID-19 outbreak started and where one continues to grow, respectively. And we know this is happening against a backdrop of rising anti-Jewish hate in this country. Congresswoman, how do you suggest we fight this anti-Semitism and the already mentioned xenophobia and racism and scapegoating that your colleagues mentioned?
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to ADL and to you for bringing us together for this Fighting Hate from Home forum. It's so incredibly important, particularly given that millions and millions of Americans are essentially sequestered at home. And while we already have a growing problem with bigotry, anti-Semitism, hatred, that has been fomented from the highest office in the land. And I concur with both of my colleagues that too much of this is generated from the White House itself, because this hatred and bigotry is already lurking in the shadows. And now many more of us are spending a lot of time shadowed because we're needing to remain at home. People have more time in their hands to foment even more hatred and bigotry. So it's really important that we use opportunities like this one to shine a spotlight and ferret out where this hatred is lurking. That having been said, in the Jewish community, this is not the first pandemic that the world has faced, and not the first pandemic in which Jews have been singled out as a source of a virus. That is occurring as we speak. There are accusations that it is Jews somehow that started the coronavirus, that created the coronavirus, and whether it is Jews who are attending George Washington University, who had to self-quarantine as a result of potential exposure to the accusations that Jews are the source of the virus, particularly because of the outbreaks in Westchester County and the Orthodox community. We have an outbreak here amongst our Orthodox community in South Florida. We absolutely need to make sure that we take opportunities like this one and use our leadership platform. Unfortunately, that the president has used his to do the opposite, to make sure that we can knock down these tropes and knock down this unwarranted, hateful, bigoted criticism. And look, we're all supposed to be pulling together to fight against a virus that we can't see. And so to, on top of that, have minority groups, and I represent a very diverse district, as you know, as well, the gateway to not only Latin America, but so many other parts of the world. And so we are in the midst of a crisis here, and we don't need to add more pain and suffering on top of it.
Well, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. So we've got a little less than 5 minutes left before I know the three of you have to go. Let me leave with one question. There shouldn't be anything partisan in pushing back against prejudice. And I think we can all agree that fighting coronavirus let alone the xenophobia that we're seeing fomented today, should not be political. So getting beyond that, what do you think we can do? What guidance would you have for an organization like ADL, for the people on the line today? How can we push back against this hate? I'd welcome thoughts from all three panelists.
Well, I'll just start off by saying the more we speak out, the greater the impact will be. When the president was saying, using this term, Chinese virus, over and over again, Chinese American groups led an effort. There were 2 letters sent to the White House, one by the Asian Pacific Americans for Public Affairs that had 40 national groups, and another led by the Organizations for Chinese Americans that had 150 advocates, and in fact, I think ADL was included amongst them.
I think so.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. And as a result, on Tuesday, the president had to say that Asian Americans should also be protected. That was a great step forward.
I just wanted to add that, you know, it really is about speaking out, but it's also about speaking out at the right time. I think if you're in a setting where you're in a chat group, or before we started all hunkering down, you know, I still can't tolerate people who sit around or hear the racist comments or the discriminatory comments and don't say something, or just simply say, hey, that's not funny, it's actually hurtful. You know, your actions can help a lot. And secondly, it's also about making sure you report it, because people like your group and others who keep track of these things need the data, so that when we have a hearing on this topic, which we have had one on Judiciary Committee, which I sit on, you know, people come armed with data, so that when people tell us, oh no, it's not really happening, I don't discriminate, I'm not a racist, because we've heard that coming from administration officials. They simply say, oh no, I'm not a racist. But if you present data, tell stories, share anecdotes, it becomes more real. And lastly, just mobilize, you know, join groups like ADL and others who are fighting back in a very meaningful way, and send them the resources that they need to do an even better job. And thank you again for having us.
Just to be a little more granular on what we can do, obviously we've been going through a very difficult time in our country with the dramatic, precipitous rise of white supremacy and anti-Semitism and bigotry against many groups. I have, in my community, convened several times a very diverse group of religious and community leaders in response to, for example, when we had the Tree of Life shootings, when we've had anti-Semitic incidents occur, and we need to repeatedly come together. Obviously, we can't gather now, but making sure that we have diverse groups of religious and community leaders that represent the panoply of diversity in a community, and not only vocally joining together to fight hatred, but to plan together on how we can push back as a community is what we've focused on here in our congressional district. And I've had Congressman Alcee Hastings and Congressman Ted Deutsch, as well as Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, join us in that. So I would really encourage ADL members who are listening to reach out to your members of Congress and your community elected leadership to convene similar gatherings, because if we don't continue to shine a spotlight on this and work together at the local level, then it's just going to continue to lurk in the shadows, and we'll keep having. It's like we're playing whack-a-mole.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Well, Congresswoman, I know you have to leave to go to the caucus meeting, so I want to really thank all of you, Congresswoman Chu, Congresswoman Garcia, and Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, for taking the time to join us today. Like all of us, I know your personal lives have been upended by this pandemic, and your role as members of the House and your station as national leaders, you know, it's really an honor to have you join us today. So thank you for doing what you can to keep our country safe and our communities healthy. We appreciate it, and we wish you Godspeed today.
You're welcome, and thank you for giving us this platform, and all ADL does.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless.
All right. So I want to sincerely and profusely thank the members again for their time, their insights, and their patriotism. And now let's turn to the next portion of the conversation. I want to talk a bit more about the problem, but also the solutions that I tried to get into with the members just now. I mean, today we're talking about how racism and scapegoating related to the COVID-19 pandemic is being erected against Asian Americans, Latino Americans, American Jews. And we heard about what our national leaders are doing to confront it. What I'd like to do for just a few minutes is share what discrimination, racism, and scapegoating we're tracking at ADL, what we're doing about it, and how we can all be engaged as a force for good. That's why I'm so pleased to have so many people on the call today. Look, unfortunately, I think the human urge, it's almost an impulse to try to find someone to blame for our problems. You know, they did it is a favorite refrain among fearmongers. In the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of causing the bubonic plague. The LGBTQ community was vilified in just the past few decades during the AIDS epidemic. Mexicans and many Latinos were scapegoated during an outbreak of the H1N1 swine flu in 2009. And people of African descent were blamed in 2014 for the Ebola outbreak. In each case, the accused community experienced marginalization, bias, and even violence. And the blame game already is playing out during this health crisis. Internationally, there have been many attempts to link COVID-19 to Israel and to Jews, with some people basically claiming the virus is part of a conspiracy of profit and gain by Israel and the global Jewish community. In Iran, Press TV, a semi-official government outlet, broadcast a number of reports claiming that Zionists were behind the coronavirus. Quotes included that Zionist elements developed a deadlier strain of coronavirus against Iran. And we know that mosques in Turkey and the Palestinian territories, and in Gaza specifically, and across the Arab world, have been doing the same. And as you heard just a few minutes ago, here at home, we've seen politicians decrying the virus as the Chinese virus or Kung flu. Now, it's not to say that it might not be true that the virus, the original strain, originated in the Wuhan province of China, but at a time when Asian Americans are experiencing discrimination and hate, to use a term that reinforces division seems at best irresponsible, and at worst, intentionally fomenting bias. We've seen pundits pointing the finger at prominent Jews, other hate mongers suggesting that foreigners are solely responsible for spreading the virus. Some extremists blaming and even committing actual acts of violence in the real world against Asian Americans, as we heard about from Congresswoman Chu. And certainly internet chatter from white supremacists has blamed the health crisis on foreigners. Since January, we've heard almost 24 reports of Asian Pacific American individuals being threatened and harassed on the street. These incidents include being told to go back to China, being blamed for, quote, bringing the virus to America, being referred to with racial slurs and spat on, even assaulted. And the consequences of this racism and scapegoating, I think, are not just, in acts of individual pain. They create societal harm. As COVID-19 sweeps the nation, vulnerable communities who are stigmatized are terrified about how this will impact their communities. We know that immigrants in particular fear seeking medical help, especially those who are undocumented or in mixed status families. So this just adds to their sense of vulnerability. Additionally, white supremacists have increased their efforts to not only promulgate conspiracy theories blaming the coronavirus on Jews or Asians, they've expressed their hope that the virus will target minority groups, and some have even suggested that those amongst their ranks who are infected with the virus should go visit synagogues, centers of Jewish life, or even target law enforcement to intentionally spread the virus to them. Now, we know that white supremacy is on the rise. We've talked about this at ADL many times, and we've seen it manifest again in this moment. Twice in recent weeks, individuals associated with the American Identity Movement, an extremist alt-right group, held flash protests in Sacramento using banners reading, "Stop the spread, stop immigration." And at a protest in February, they wore hazmat suits at the Sacramento International Airport, calling for the airport to halt incoming travel from China. Although the vast majority of the coronavirus-related real-world activity has consisted of posting offensive propaganda flyers and holding demonstrations, in one case, a white supremacist was shot and killed by the FBI as he accelerated a plot to bomb a hospital treating coronavirus patients. And some of you may have heard, earlier this week, federal authorities plan to arrest 36-year-old Timothy Wilson in Missouri following the culmination of a long-running domestic terror investigation. According to the FBI, he planned to use a car bomb to blow up a local hospital currently coping with the coronavirus outbreak because he wanted to, quote, cause severe harm and mass casualties. This is a man who also discussed targeting a school with a large Black student population, a synagogue, and a mosque. But authorities believe that it was the COVID-19 pandemic that accelerated his plan to commit an act of domestic terror against the medical facility. His plan to attack a hospital appears to echo some of the white supremacist desire to accelerate societal breakdown and spark a race war. They call this idea accelerationism. So like with the biological disease of COVID-19, anti-Semitism, racism, and scapegoating also threaten to mutate and spiral out of control if we don't act quickly. As America responds to the spread of the pandemic, we here at ADL are actively mobilized and continuing the important work of fighting hate for good. While recognizing we live in uncertain and unpredictable times, I think all of us realize that our vital mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all continues. And it remains just as important today as it was a week ago or a month ago or a year ago. Max Sevilla, ADL's Vice President of Government Relations, joined Congresswoman Chu along with Asian Pacific American advocates and the CDC at an event earlier this month to show solidarity and support for the Asian American community. I myself co-authored an op-ed in the last Friday in USA Today with my friend and former presidential candidate Andrew Yang, calling on Americans of all ethnicity and faith to reject appeals to hate in these difficult times. And I'm proud that ADL currently is leading an effort in the Jewish community, organizing a petition that already has dozens and dozens and dozens of signatures, calling on leaders and individuals to show kindness and solidarity and to make extra efforts to reach out to one another in this moment and not to blame and scapegoat. In fact, we will launch a related campaign to include leaders from other faiths and communities, and we plan on going all out to ask people to join this movement of solidarity to commit to fighting hate. We also joined with other civil rights groups to urge Congress to help states prepare for an inclusive and fair voting process for the 2020 elections in the wake of COVID-19. We're deeply concerned that and want to make sure that immigrants and people of all socioeconomic levels have the opportunity to benefit from the COVID-19 relief package that's moving through Congress and waiting, I believe, for the House to vote on it. And finally, as many of you know, the ADL is deeply engaged in anti-bias education, and we've provided updated materials to help educators and families with resources about how to talk to your children and your students about the virus. And we're currently working on new resources to engage young people in discussions about this crisis and some of the issues related to it. So whether it's through anti-bias education, advocacy on Capitol Hill, are working on the ground with our different kind of our colleagues in the different faith and ethnic communities, and simply using our voice. We're committed to doing everything we can to fighting hate for good. Why don't I pause here, and Sasha or Max, perhaps we can take some questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name is Max Sevilli, and I'm Vice President of Government Relations and Community Engagement at ADL. As a reminder, if you're joining us today from a computer, there's a chat option on the bottom of the Zoom program where you can type in questions for Jonathan. Alternatively, you may email your questions to onlineevents@adl.org. We have allotted about 15 minutes for Q&A, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as we can. We have already received a few questions, so let's dive right in. Jonathan, I'm seeing a question. Someone's asking, this hate issue is even bigger than crimes and threat to certain targeted ethnic and religious groups. Hatred exists in the environment amongst conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, certain news programs and universities. It's in the environment. How do we approach the bigger issue?
Well, look, I think it's fair to say that racism didn't start with the coronavirus, right? This isn't some sort of symptom prompted by the disease. In fact, many would say anti-Semitism is often described as the oldest hatred, and hate seems to be the most permanent disease afflicting the human condition. How do we deal with that? Well, I think there are several steps that we believe work here at ADL. Number one, I think and ways to respond to hate when we see it. Number one, I think you need to speak up. All of us have an obligation to interrupt intolerance whenever we hear it, whether it's at the water cooler or I guess at the proverbial Zoom cooler in our current, remote environment. So everyone needs to feel like, whether it's at the dinner table or in the locker room or again, in any situation, speak up and say something when you hear prejudice spread. That's number one. Number two, share facts. Avoid the tendency to get emotional, to get hysterical, to get political. There's nothing partisan in pushing back on prejudice. There are plenty of, we had 3 members from the Democratic side of the aisle who participated today, but there are plenty of Republicans who are equally offended by racism and hate. This isn't, no party has a monopoly on morality. We find extremists on both sides of the aisle. So I think it's really important that all of us step up and stand together with one another in a fact-based, non-emotional way. Finally, along with speaking up and sharing facts, show strength. Be an ally. Don't just stand up when you hear something against your community. Stand up when you see someone's doing it, targeting someone else. Be an upstander, not a bystander. And find creative ways to stand side by side with people, regardless if the fact they may pray differently or look differently or speak a different language than you. So I think those might be things I would suggest as people try to think about how they can stand up against hate.
There's a question that came in that I find very relatable. I'm actually dealing with some members of Congress that express similar interest in working with ADL on this question, on this issue. And that is, what responsibility do social media companies have to moderate forums that host racism and scapegoating? And I think it's particularly a salient issue in that many of us and our children are at home and spending lots of time in front of computers and electronics. So what's the responsibility of online platforms vis-a-vis hateful content?
It's a great question. At ADL, we believe deeply that Facebook is really the front line today in fighting hate. As we do our socializing and our shopping, and I guess one could say now, all of our working, so much of our work life has moved online. We shouldn't be surprised that hate has moved line on as well. And while, as a former tech executive myself, I can tell you how grateful I am for the innovation and all the impact that technology has had. It also has become, social media has really become a breeding ground for bigotry. So we have worked intensively with the big technology platforms to fight hate on their platform, on their systems. In fact, we opened up an office in Silicon Valley just a few years ago and it's run by a software executive who now works at ADL. So we've been talking to Google, Facebook, Twitter, and their products and their brand teams, Instagram, YouTube, and whatnot, encourage them to take hate off their platforms by better enforcing their own terms of service and by taking those egregious content off. We're going to continue to push and push and push to get the platforms to do more. And if anyone hasn't seen it, I'd encourage you to watch the YouTube video from last year when Sacha Baron Cohen spoke at ADL's annual Never Is Now conference and delivered a really remarkable talk about the role of Facebook and social media in general in spouting hate.
Another question that we're receiving has to do with what can individuals do themselves to fight extremism, scapegoating, anti-Semitism, etc. And in particular, what can young people, college students in particular, do to confront these menaces?
Look, hate takes many forms. Sometimes it's obvious with the white supremacists screaming at someone in front of a hospital or an airport. Sometimes it's more subtle, like a college student saying that all Zionists are Nazis or some disgusting anti-Semitic venom they try to mask as sort of a political statement. Look, whether you're a student on a college campus or a person in a professional setting, all of us can find ways, again, to speak up, share facts, and show strength. And whether it's using your voice to join together with a community that's different from you, or in a dispassionate way disproving when people, again, try to mask prejudice as sort of PC speech, there's no doubt that everyone has the ability to push back against prejudice.
Besides prejudice and racism, scapegoating, there's the question of misinformation. How can we fight misinformation, which is often related to the issues that we are discussing today?
Yeah, I mean, like scapegoating is sort of, and maybe anti-Semitism in particular, is sort of the oldest form of fake news. I think we should have a zero tolerance policy on intolerance. And I think we need to demand that the social media companies do much more to combat disinformation. Look, frankly, there's a reason why to get an op-ed published in the New York Times, you have to run through a battery of their editors. Or to get something pushed out on broadcast, it has to pass editorial scrutiny. Or to get something even on the radio, you have to go through a system. The idea that I can post anything, anywhere, anytime online without any checks, without any review, I think at best is irresponsible. And in our current environment, it might be downright dangerous. So we want to see the technology companies innovate their way around this issue to apply the same kinds of standards of decency that long had disciplined traditional media. And if they can't do it, guess what? Then the government's going to have to get involved. I'd rather that didn't happen, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Another question is, you mentioned a lot of efforts that ADL is leading, a lot of research, investigation, reporting, and ways to confront what we're seeing. Where can people find those resources? How can they be engaged? And then once they get involved, what are the sort of specific actions that they can take?
Listen, that's a very good question. I'm glad that it was asked. There's a lot of resources that we have available to help people understand how to push back, how to call out hate when it happens, how to push back against prejudice, understand the issues in depth. And much of that is available at adl.org. Go to our website. There's some really excellent and rich resources to help people understand, again, how to deal with hate. And sometimes in order to confront it today, you need to understand where it comes from. I'm quite proud of a piece that we just published within the last few weeks that you can find at antisemitism.adl.org. And that is a new resource we've created called Anti-Semitism Uncovered. This is sort of a first of its kind product that we developed to give people a sense about the history of anti-Semitism, and then to walk them through some of the most common myths or anti-Semitic tropes. Jews and money, Jews and power, anti-Zionism, and this accusation that we sometimes refer to as the blood libel, that Jews intentionally try to kill other populations. I think this is really important. I'm proud of this resource. You can get it again on our website, and it's being continually updated with examples. So some of the coronavirus examples we've talked about would show up there. So it allows people to understand the history of a myth, but also what are some modern manifestations of it, then how do you push back on it? It's worth looking at. You can find it at antisemitism.adl.org.
Another question, maybe the last question since we're at time. Besides our focus on anti-Semitism, racism, and scapegoating, which has been the focus of this conversation, the COVID-19 is a human crisis, a health and human crisis. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of partnerships that ADL has seek out, how important these have been, partnerships with other intergroup communities, partnerships with other interfaith communities, and also partnerships with other nonprofit organizations that are at the forefront of providing services that are absolutely needed, necessary at this time, and that these organizations themselves are facing huge crises at the moment?
Yeah, so we work extensively at the ADL with a range of different organizations. I mean, partnership is really a mantra for us. So there are a few things I'll point out. I think number one, within the Jewish community, we work with Jewish federations and APAC and Stand With Us and the different religious streams like the Religious Action Center, the Reform Jewish Community, Conservative Movement, the Orthodox movement of Chabad. We really work extensively across the ideological and religious spectrum with elements of our community to support those groups in need on different projects, on different programs. Secondly, we work across outside of the Jewish realm. I should also make sure that I mention, we work also with B'chol Lashon and the Field Building Initiative, and those organizations working extensively with Jews of color. Secondly, we work outside of the Jewish realm with a range of different organizations representing different faith and ethnic groups and those of different gender identities and sexual orientation. So from the NAACP and the National Urban League and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, we've joined these groups on amicus briefs, we've joined these groups in legal actions, excuse me, we've joined these groups in mass mobilizations and marches and whatnot. We also work with groups that represent the Latino community, including groups like Unidos US, formerly known as La Raza, LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. We love NALEO and other groups. And in fact, we're partnering with Unidos and LULAC on an effort to provide their people with training about hate crimes so they can push back on the emerging trend of anti-Latino hate crimes that seem to be spreading across the country. And then we also work with groups representing others, whether it's Asian Americans Advancing Justice, whether it's, I don't know, a lot of other groups that work with the Sikh Coalition, the Hindu groups representing the Arab American community and the Muslim community, the Mormon community, just a range of different organizations, as well as the Human Rights Campaign, Lambda Legal, and of course some of the parent groups like the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. So my view on all this work is, though we've done a lot in our 107 years, there is so much left to learn. And whether it's taking legal action, whether it's organizing and advocacy efforts, whether it's mounting mass mobilizations like walks against hate, as we've done in Houston and Philadelphia and other cities, concerts against hate, as we've done in Florida and in Washington, D.C., or conferences like the Good Fight in Boston, and of course, our Never Is Now conference that takes place in the fall in New York City. We believe we've got to work with others in order to really fight hate for good.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, and that concludes our Q&A. As a reminder, this session has been recorded and will be available on the ADL YouTube channel for you to watch again or to share. I'd like to thank the Congresswomen Chu, Garcia, and Wasserman Schultz, as well as Jonathan and Max for your time today and your excellent insights. And thank you to everyone who joined us today.
I'm just sorry. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I really am. But you know, again, there's resources on adl.org, and you can hit us up on Twitter, and please keep in touch.
Absolutely, Jonathan. Couldn't have said it better myself. We will be continuing to provide these weekly calls on a variety of topics, and we'll keep you apprised by email. I hope you all stay safe and well and have a wonderful and healthy rest of the day.